So I'm really glad that Norm could join us today. I prepared my presentation assuming he wouldn't be able to connect from his camp, but he's here. That's great, and hopefully, well, Norm will see some video clips of himself. So, but we could have some of Norm's live comments at the end as well, and. Actually, there's a lot of people who are out in camp. Otherwise, we might have had a few more. This would have been a multi-person presentation today. But so let's go ahead. I'll just share my screen. All right. So Doug, and there are some videos, and I've got my headset on here. So in case sometimes you can't hear the video if I've got my headset on, so I'll just unplug. So just let me know if we get to videos and you can't hear anything. So
okay.
All right.
If everybody would like to mute their microphones as Cecil starts, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. So just thanks, Miigwech, Doug, for inviting me to share some reflections, thoughts, and some stories today about complex past, diverse futures, with a focus on the restoration of St. Thomas Church. And I want to look at that within the context of what I would call Canada's oldest continuous Indigenous European middle ground. So let's see if this works. There we go. So let's just situate ourselves. So Moose Factory, Ontario, Canada, the deep south of the Arctic Ocean. And let's see here. On the Mussissippi, on the Moose River, in Mushkegowski, the land of the Mushkego Cree. So Norm, if we're looking out towards the bay, but Norm's camp is looking over to the right here and a little back behind us. So he's sort of southwest of here, southeast of here actually. If I understand correctly. Yeah.
Cecil, your screen, we're getting your home screen. We haven't got your slideshow yet.
Oh, okay. Well, is that better?
There we go. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So
did we miss a few at the original? There we go. There we go.
Is this good?
Yeah. We're still getting, we've got a lot there. Perfect. Okay.
Okay, great. So I won't repeat what I just said, but I'll just skim through the slides here and show the maps and the images here. So Moose Factory is in the deep south of the Arctic Ocean, as I mentioned, and here's the Moose River in Mushkegowski. And as I mentioned, Norm's camp is a bit southeast of here. And I want to begin with a quote from Norm. If you Google Paris, images of the Eiffel Tower will show up. If you Google India, the Taj Mahal will show up. If you Google Moose Factory, St. Thomas Church will show up. It's iconic. In a time when we are tearing down statues and monuments, this community has chosen to uphold this building, this historic church, because of what it stands for. It's in remembrance of our heritage, our past, the good things and the bad things, and the things we say we will never, ever forget. Those are the words that Norm spoke last summer before a legislative committee in the province of Ontario, speaking to questions of heritage. I want to just kind of skim through some photos here. So before St. Thomas Church in the 1850s, there was a small church, and this is a sketch of it. But here's the church built in 1864 that we're referring to. So this is a fairly early image. And a choir was added in 1885. I just want to give you a sense of the church here with these photos. And this is not far away, an Indian camp. So, and I'll come back to this after. So it wasn't at this time a permanent settlement for most of the Cree. It was a summer gathering site, as it had been before the HBC set up their post in 1673. And it continued to be that The church, again, with the Hudson's Bay Company post pre-1900. This is in the 1930s. So this is just outside the church, local Cree leaving after the service. And again, same period. (1934) aerial shots. And here's Moose Factory 1963. You see there's a hospital that's been built and a new residential school, which the church was connected with. And here's the church in 1973 at the tricentennial celebration for Moose Factory's establishment in 1673. And here are some images from that celebration. And then there was a new vestry added to the building in 1982. Some other images, the interior of the church. And the church today. So I want to go to this clip here and let Norm speak a bit.
No volume, Cecil.
We've been born and raised here, or if you visited this place. And this is the first thing, and it's a gift that I was given by the Select Vestry for the years of service that I had with St. Thomas Church as their minister. The second thing I wanted to show you was this here. And I did a wedding one time. Gerald Coleman Jr. gave this to me as a gift of appreciation when I did their wedding, and you'll see that this also is a very nice portrait of St. Thomas Church. I'm the chair of the St. Thomas Church Restoration Committee, and I just wanted to share that with you that this is a very important project that we've undertaken, and we hope that we can get your support as well. Those of you who are living in Moose Factory and even beyond, because this is an iconic building here in Moose Factory. Try Googling Moose Factory.
So I'll pause there.
Hi.
So today I just want to kind of give you, we've already done the brief overview of the church. And I wanted to share some film clips from Moose Factory and its history. I think it'll speak much better than I can and give you a sense of the history. And then I'll come back to those clips afterwards as I go through the rest of the presentation. And then we'll just end with some discussion and questions. So let me just share with you some of these clips here from, first we'll start off with clips from a documentary on the Gathering of Our People, which is an annual event that happens in Moose Factory over the last decade and a half. And it's commemorating and replicating in many ways the summer gatherings that would happen long before the Hudson's Bay Company Post was set up here. So,
for countless generations, the Moose Cree people have lived on this land. A land that demands respect, offers refuge, and reveals its amazing beauty. The Moose Cree have survived on the resources from the land, taking only what is needed to survive, and have always shared with family, friends, and visitors into their territory. Sharing has been the prime value that has ensured survival for them. It's this deep-seated value of sharing that summer gatherings have always taken place. Today, the Moose Cree are reviving this age-old tradition. In the contemporary sense, the third annual Gathering of Our People 2003 was the focal point of sharing, celebrating, and rejoicing the cultural identity and traditional values. This year, the inaugural Cree Fest made its debut in conjunction with the gathering. Its musical and traditional components made a perfect match which only added to the whole week's festivities.
welcome to the elders, the youth, members and visitors from the immediate area and from the coast. Greetings from Moose Factory, home of the Moose Cree First Nation. I would like to acknowledge and especially welcome our Inuit guests who have traveled quite a distance to be with us again during this kind of celebration. On behalf of the Deputy Chief, Council, and membership, we wish you all an enjoyable stay within our community. On behalf of my Chief and Council, the membership, I now declare the gathering of our people and the Cree Fest celebrations open. Thank you.
So that was Chief Norm mentioned in his opening remarks. I hope you can hear I hope the sound quality is good enough, but he welcomed, I think it was about 300 Inuits who'd come to the community. These were Inuits who had relatives who had died in the local hospital, the TB hospital set up in the 50s. And, were coming down to really to find closure because they had many loved ones who were buried in the cemetery at Moose Factory behind St. Thomas Church. Their bodies had never been brought home. They had never been able to come and mourn for them and say goodbye. So they came down and they were put up in Cree homes, and it was really a very powerful ceremony. And at the annual at this gathering, there was a memorial service at the cemetery, and all the Inuit families that came down. Everybody else was gathered around in the cemetery, but the Inuit families entered the church and had their own service. And there was an Inukshuk memorial set up, and there's some clips here that just show that. So I wanted to begin with some of these more recent film clips to really give you a sense of the people and place today. I mean, this is 2003, that dates back to, but it is more recent. And now I want to kind of shift over and share with you some clips from an earlier period. This is the earliest film footage from Moose Factory from 1919. And it's followed with some film footage from 1937.
I used to have to make the clothing for the babies. I sewed their clothing right until they were old enough, running around, and I made clothes for them. Well, my grandchildren wore moccasins.
You're hearing the voice of Nellie Ferries, and you can see the church in the background there. She would have been a young woman probably in this group of girls here playing, because her mother was translating for a biography that was being done of Ellen Smallboy by an anthropologist. This was 1937. So Ruby McLeod, who you'll see later in this, in one of the next clips, that's Nellie's mother, and she was interpreting, and Nellie was here among the women. So I'm realizing that let's see, our time. Actually, no. Yes, we started after 4, so I'm okay for time. So I'm going to share another clip here from another film.
Most children born of the early marriages between Crees and Scots were brought up as Crees. Today, the descendants know very little of their Scottish ancestors. They remember the Scots only by reputation. When the last of the sailing ships came from Scotland, 77-year-old Ruby McLeod was still a young girl.
They used to have whiskey, all the companies, what they call the company servants, used to get their allowance of whiskey every fall. And some of them old men make them do them till the next season. Make it do them, they were very mean, you know, they'd give a little drink to anybody, they'd put the bottle away again.
Well, that's what the Scots are like.
Yeah, well, that's what they used to do here. They used to do. They wouldn't and go and fill you up with empty a bottle on you, no. It was just one little drink and then they put away in the cupboard.
So let's see here. I'll just move on to our next clip. Wait, no, that's the last one. So this film actually follows Cree fiddlers who go back to the Orkney Islands. Well, they've never been there, but they're bringing back to the Orkney fiddling tunes that hadn't been heard in generations. So it's quite an interesting film, and really shows the connections that were there between Orkney and James Bay over several centuries. So I wanted to kind of give you these images so that you have them in your mind as I kind of go through a little bit more of a narrative here of the historical context. I mentioned at the start that this area and Moose Factory in particular are really in many ways Canada's oldest continuous Indigenous newcomer middle ground. And I'm taking that from that term from Richard White's book, The Middle Ground. For those of you who've read the book, you may recall that he was quite surprised to find that when he did this research, to find that the relationship between Indigenous and Europeans in the Great Lakes region for well over 100 years, 1650 to 1815, was not defined by sort of Europeans imposing themselves on Indigenous people, but very much by a balance of power and a need for meeting on a middle ground. And in many ways, he also describes at the end of his book how this middle ground collapsed after 1815. In Moose Factory and James Bay, you had the same kind of middle ground where people met, they encountered each other in a context of really interdependence and much more dependence on the part of the Hudson's Bay Company and Orkney Islanders on the Cree than vice versa for most of the history, because they were arriving in a land that they didn't know and understand and had to learn from the Cree. But it was really an interdependent relationship. And really only in the 20th century did you have a diminishing of that middle ground, but it certainly didn't disappear. So what really is dominant throughout this history is relationships of intermarriage, of social, economic, cultural reciprocity, and you see that in the fiddling music, in so many ways in the family heritage. So the filmmaker who did the Gathering of Our People documentary, his last name is Linklater, which is a very common name in the Orkney Islands. I mean, there's just Ruby McLeod, Nellie Ferries, all of these people. There's very few people that don't have some connection with Orkney, Scotland, etc. in the area, but they are predominantly Cree nonetheless. So it's quite a striking and unique history in many ways for this reason. Just to kind of provide support for this, I wanted to just quote from Grand Chief Abel Bosom of the Crees of Quebec, giving a talk a few years back at McGill. He referred to the first 250 years or so of history in the James Bay area, Iwishchi in particular, in terms of partnership. So, you know, the point that I'm making is echoed by others in this regard. So, but Moose Factory and James Bay are also in many ways an indigenous middle ground long before they were an indigenous European middle ground. So, which is of course no surprise, right? But just to give you a sense of the specifics, you've got Omushkegowaski, which is more or less Ontario Cree, and Iwishchi, the Quebec Cree, and Moose Cree there on the left is these are the people of Moose Factory. But Moose Factory is also welcomed in, the Moose Cree welcomed in many other Cree from other Omushkego communities. And you also have Crees who come over from Quebec and establish themselves in Moose Factory. So Moose Factory, unique among the James Bay communities, is really in many ways a microcosm of multicultural Canada, but with a predominance of Cree, but not just one dialect of Cree, at least two dialects of Cree, if not three. So it's quite an interesting place in many ways. Here's just a quick map of the island. You've got 2/3 of this 2 by 3 mile island is reserve of Moose Cree First Nation, and the rest is where you have residents of Mo-Quebec First Nation. So these are Crees of Quebec who established themselves in Moose Factory and didn't transfer into Moose Cree First Nation. And then you have other, company families of mixed culture or non-status Indians, they were called once, and people working at the hospital and local schools in that area as well. So I wanted to kind of highlight Fred Moore here. His maternal grandfather signed Treaty Number 9 in 1905, but his mother lost her status because she married somebody without status. And so although his grandfather signed Treaty Number 9, he was considered non-status and lost in many ways his hunting rights. But he regained them after the 1985 Bill C-31. So, the reality of who he is in terms of his relationships to his ancestors and to others around him didn't change. But what changed around him was the political legal categories by which he and others were defined. And the fundamental point I want to make here is that Moose Factory, and this context, is an interesting place for exploring sometimes the contrast between the rights and responsibilities that flow from real relationships, which are fluid and on the ground, and those that are defined in shifting political legal categories. And the two don't always coincide. And the first, I think, are really what the Cree focus on, and the second are coming from impositions from outside. But the other important point I want to make is that the best way to understand people is to think not in terms of individuals and groups, but in terms of persons in relationship, and tremendous web of relationships that tie people to each other, and also to think in terms of cultural centers of gravity rather than cultural boundaries. And the other point I wanted to make is, well, there you've got on the left, there's another photo.
Cecil?
Yes?
Cecil? Hi.
Yes.
Sorry to jump in. It's just a moment ago, Norm raised his hand. I'm wondering if he's got a point in reference to something you were saying. And Norm, if you want to try and unmute yourself.
I don't have the screen with.
No, I've got it here, but I
Okay.
can't. No, he's staying unmuted. Okay, no, carry on. Sorry about that.
Okay. So Ruby McLeod here is in the middle on the left. We saw a video clip of her. Then Nellie below. You heard her voice in one of the videos. And Ruby was the interpreter for the interviews done by Regina Flannery with Ellen Smallboy in 1937. And in her life history, Ruby speaks about living in the bush, and she mentions the Hudson Bay Company post only a few times. Her life was very much centered in the bush, even though she settled in the community later on in life. One of the points I often make in teaching in teaching my classes is that Ellen Smallboy never saw herself as marginalized or colonized. She was not marginalized, she was simply centered elsewhere. And I think it's very easy to kind of read back into the past a colonialism or a power balance of the present or the more recent past. To take that and read it deep into the past. And that's part of the reason why Richard White was quite surprised to find what he found in his research, because he couldn't imagine from a contemporary perspective a context where there was interdependence and middle ground and reciprocity. So one of the challenges, certainly in the 20th century, the residential school period, the Indian Act period, is really the height of colonialism and the height of imposition from outside. But even in the midst of this, there is a Cree assertion of sovereignty and a resistance and also an integration and welcoming of people that continues even during this period. And in many ways, that period has been short-lived. But the impacts of that certainly complicate how people look at the deeper and broader history of the region. And I can say that back in the 1980s, there was quite a very strong tourism industry, but it tended to focus on the Hudson's Bay Company history and drawing people in. You could ride the Polar Bear Express. There would be thousands of tourists coming in every summer to see buildings like the Staff House. And I think within the community, there was a sense that Cree history was not being recognized. And even the Cree background for the Hudson's Bay Company history was not being recognized. And I have an anecdote to share with you in a moment that really illustrates that very well. But there was a decline in tourism, and in many ways a neglect of some of these heritage buildings, which came to be seen as, in some ways, outsider history, and as a certain polarized view came to entered into the sphere, I would say. But in the early 2000s, there was efforts to kind of revive the tourism industry on the part, and this was on the part of Moose Cree and Mo Quebec Council. They established the Moose Factory Tourism Association, and then not long afterwards, I got a historical association going, and then we entered into conversation, these two organizations, and tried to establish a broader vision that would integrate all the different aspects of Moose Factory's history and recenter it within a deeper and broader Cree history. And so we had this meeting in 2008 where the MRHHA, the Moose River Heritage and Hospitality Association, was formed. And you see here some of the leaders from the community who were present at that meeting. And we came up with this proposal, building a future with our shared past. And what we wanted to do was move beyond sort of a focus on the past simply for visitors coming in, and look at hospitality as a Cree tradition that's independent from tourism. Tourism we saw in many ways as a subset of hospitality. And here was the vision that we came up with, which emphasizes the rich historical cultural heritage of Moose Factory, Moosonee, the Moose River region. So we had the municipality of Moosonee across the river join us. It's a predominantly Cree municipality. So 3 jurisdictions, Moose, Cree, Quebec, and the town of Moosonee. So our vision acknowledged that the historical and cultural heritage is primarily Omushkego, but includes major contributions from other peoples that have become part of the present day community's political, social, religious, economic, and cultural fabric in the course of its long evolution that predates Moose Factory's establishment as a fur trade post in 1673. And that fabric is demonstrated by the community's additional EU, so Quebec Cree, Orcadian, Scottish, Norwegian, English, and French heritage. And it points to hospitality as one of the most important aspects of Moose Cree and Omushkego culture. And our mission, of course, was to preserve, document, promote, and perpetuate this heritage and tradition of hospitality, not just to benefit our own community, but the broader society to which we continue to contribute. And the idea was to kind of to draw on the support of leadership, councils, jurisdictions, as well as grassroots community members, elders, youth, harvesters, filmmakers, and so on, as well as people outside the community. So our guiding principles, I think I'll just skip over these, but I think that I'll skip over these. They're kind of reiterating some of the points already made. Over the years, the MRHHA, the Heritage Committee has hosted a number of different events, and here they're just shown. Actually, I'm sorry, the slide is improperly set up, so some of the posters are actually showing up behind these images, but that's okay. A few years back, we launched a walking tour app for Moosonee and Moose Factory. But one of the most important things we've done was we made sure that the plaque commemorating the Moose Factory buildings, the Hudson's Bay Company buildings, we made sure that the text for this plaque was revised. So back in, I think it's in the 1950s, the HBC buildings were designated as a national historic site, or at least it was, this was approved by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, but they never followed through and with the development of a plaque and the unveiling of it. And our committee was contacted in, I think it was 2010, the Heritage Committee of the MRHHA was contacted in 2010 about setting up a ceremony to unveil the plaque, and they already had an established text, and the text did not make any mention of the Cree, and it was only in English and French. And that in many ways speaks to some of the problems with the way the heritage of the community was being, and history of the community had been presented, the way the tourism industry had been developed in the 70s and 80s. Was often too much of a focus on the Hudson's Bay Company without recognizing the Cree history that frames that Hudson's Bay Company history and makes it possible. So we had the text revised and translated into Cree, and it was the plaque was unveiled in 2017 here. And here's the text, the new text. So founded in 1673 on traditional Moosonee Ililu lands, Moose Factory is the second oldest Hudson's Bay Company post. And then it goes on to describe a little bit more the post and the buildings. And it speaks to after the fur trade's decline, Moose Factory transitioned from a company town to a permanent settlement for the Ililu, on whose expertise and hospitality it had long depended. So it reframes that history of the Hudson's Bay Company within a larger Cree context and framework. And that's in many ways speaks to what we're trying to do with the MRHHA and all the activities that we're undertaking. So, and our major activity that we're undertaking right now is to, in many ways, is to take advantage of the upcoming 350th anniversary of the founding of Moose Factory back in 1673. but we frame this as more than 350 years in the making. Moose Factory from, and actually we've changed the title that you see here, Moose Factory in Omushkegowaskie, from time immemorial to 1673 to 2023. We had a public meeting last January, and a committee was set up to plan for this, and we're developing a number of lead-up events over the next 2 years. And then we're planning a series of activities and projects for the 2023 year. And we presented some of those last summer. Norm was part of that presentation to the Standing Committee on Financial and Economic Affairs at the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. And I'll speak a bit more to some of the details of what we're trying to do with this. But in essence, we're trying to take advantage of a very specific anniversary to look at a broader and deeper history and to leverage that for broad community development goals, and to dig deeper into this shared history, and ultimately to build a future with our shared past. So, and we just launched the first of 12 lead-up events, with a storytelling celebration. Some of the clips I showed you were from that video that was done. Let's see, this is one of the projects that the MRHHA is co-sponsoring, which looks at a youth leadership program that was run in the community by a teacher who came up to work originally in residential and day school context, and then stayed on within the public, within the provincial school system, and youth after him, and he's had a profound impact on the community. To the ethos that marked his project is really, in many ways, the ethos. It's an ethos of reciprocity, and it connected deep with Cree traditions of reciprocity. And in many ways, I think that's why this youth program had such a powerful impact. Now, excuse me just a moment. I have to ask my children to be a bit quiet.
Hello, everyone. Well, Cecil's managing another hecklers. Don't forget, if you want to ask any questions or make any comments, please don't hesitate putting them in, adding them to the chat box. Okay, Cecil, everything okay?
Yes, yes. They just
Great.
forgot that I'm doing a presentation here, so that's fine. You know what? I might just put my headset back on because I don't have any more. Well, I have one more video. So, so I wanted to kind of just end with some questions. Some of the difficult questions that we kind of have to deal with. And the difference between an analysis of colonialism versus what I call analytical colonialism. And what I mean by that is the reality of colonialism is there, but it's not the same across Canada and across North America. And there is a danger of losing sight of that unique history in Moose Factory and James Bay, and in some ways letting a different history in some ways colonize our understanding of our own history in Moose Factory and James Bay. In other words, we could lose sight of what is unique, which is this long history of reciprocity that predates some of the worst of colonialism in the 20th century. But it becomes very easy to lose sight of that. So the questions: what are the only lessons from the past lessons of what went wrong, or lessons of radical cultural difference in critique? How do we critique colonialism more deeply without missing or misconstruing local and regional examples of reciprocity? You know, how do we dig deeper into what went wrong without losing sight of what went right, and vice versa? And what happens if decolonization is not founded on a vision that transcends not only colonialism, but itself? Is there not a risk that it might simply extend colonial paradigms of division and difference into the past and the future, and perhaps ironically impose new patterns of uniformity and assimilation? So in other words, you know, where we end up with the same history of colonialism told across the country, where the regional variations are lost, and also the relationships that pre-existed colonialism, for example, we lose sight of those as well, right? So this is the risk. So what does this history reveal about the ideal and challenge of drawing out and cultivating the best in ourselves and others based on an ethic of reciprocity? How can these examples of reciprocity help envision reconciliation and decolonization that are not based on either suppression or assertion of difference? And I want to end just with a quote from Cree elder Raphael Wabineau, who emphasized the need for reciprocity when he responded to a question about what was needed in the communities in the 1970s. He said, we need a cultural center where we can bring the best of Northern and Southern, i.e. Cree and non-Cree cultures together. His vision was grounded in experience. It was not merely aspirational. It was grounded in a longer and deeper history of these communities. I want to close and give Norm the last word here. Sorry about the volume.
We told the story of who we are, our past, our history, and about this building here, and what we would like to see in the future, a restored building.
I don't think you can hear that. Can you, Doug?
This is what we have done. We told the story of who we are.
Barely, just barely.
Well, maybe, you know what, since Norm's online, I'll just let him speak rather than...
It's a brilliant photo. It's a brilliant photo.
Yeah, so this was the final clip from our 2-hour-long storytelling celebration that the MRHHA organized as the first of 12 lead-up events in anticipation of the 2023 year. And the idea with those events is to engage community members more and more in the conversation about what this anniversary means and about how we're going to take advantage of that anniversary to look at the broader and deeper history and how we can build a future with our shared past. So thank you, and I'll just open it up to questions, and also, to Norm to jump in, and I think Wendy's on the line too. So
yes, I saw her there.
She's also on our St. Thomas committee.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Cecil. That was great. There's some really complicated questions there you're asking, some complex insights. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I particularly liked who was the old girl going on about how she was going to miss her whiskey.
Well, yeah, talking about the stingy servings of whiskey. Yeah, that's Ruby McLeod, who I knew when I met her when I was quite young, and her daughter Nellie Ferries was also appearing in those videos there. But yeah, so she's of very clearly of mixed ancestry, and many ways speaks to that character of Moose Factory and its history.
Ruby was quite a character.
Ah, there's Wendy. Good. Now, I don't know that we can, Norm mentioned earlier that he didn't have any audio, so I don't know that he can speak from where he's dialing in. Do you want to ask Wendy something, Cecil, that maybe she could add?
Well, let me just briefly well, maybe Wendy, do you want to introduce yourself?
I lived in Moose Factory for 8 years, and St. Thomas was very much a part of my life. And so I live now in Barrie, Ontario, near Toronto, but I'm really interested in helping and learning more about the history.
Thanks, Wendy.
And Wendy published a local newspaper for many years, which is a great treasure trove historical information now. So.
Cecil, I've got a question here from Stuart Page. He's a conservation architect in southeast of England. Stuart's wondering, he's saying, am I correct in thinking that the local experience of colonialism is worse in the 20th century?
Absolutely. I mean, it's really, you could almost, I don't think you could speak of colonialism before the late 19th century. And if you're looking at the east coast of James Bay, you know, there's two books that have been written by Toby Moranton. I think Grand Chief Abel Bosom was in many ways drawing from that history when he made his comment about, you know, the first 250 years being marked by partnership. But the first book goes up to 1870, and it's entitled Partners in Furs, and the second book is from 1870 to about 1970, and it's entitled White Man's Gonna Get You. So you can see the difference, right? Abel Bosom speaks about the invasion, and he's referring to the 1970s when the Quebec government began to flood their lands. So, you know, you can certainly go back before 1970, but really the imposition of the Indian Act and of residential schools was largely a 20th century phenomenon. But there's, even within that context, and there's a great story I could tell of a medical doctor, an eye doctor, who came in. He was not a Canadian. I haven't been able to track down more information about him. Actually, all that I know about him is from a typescript collection of stories that were shared with him by his Cree patients. And that typescript was left in an obscure file in an archive at Laval University. And it's an amazing collection of stories. But what's really interesting is the introduction to the stories, where this medical doctor, who's very much shaped by the ideas of race and evolution of the time, he speaks about how he had certain assumptions about, you know, the skull size that people would have in the communities, and, you know, and intelligence and all this, and then he's very honestly, you know, reveals how those ideas were completely off. And he shares stories of how he stumbled through learning Cree, and, you know, and made a bit of an idiot from himself, but learned to laugh at himself. And basically he came in with certain ideas about race and evolution and superiority and inferiority, and the Cree drew him out of those and into community and into relationship, shared stories with him, and in many ways transformed him. So that's so even at the height of 20th century colonialism, you've got stories like that, and stories of John Delaney coming into the community in the mid 60s and establishing with others a youth leadership program where, you know, he really, it was governed by an ethos where he saw in these Cree students the tremendous abilities that they had, and just drew that out. And today, I mean, there's just the impact that he's had in the community is profound, such that, you know, you have the youth center named after this former residential school teacher and day school teacher. Now, he was one of those that came in and was very critical of some of the things that were going on, the full revelation of which came later. But really, so it's definitely the 20th century is the peak of colonialism. Before that, you know, you've got fur traders in the late 19th century speaking about, you know, their children starving to death in the bush. You know, it was a difficult life, and starvation could take anybody. The land was a harsh teacher in many ways. It was a provider, but also a harsh teacher. If you made a mistake, there were consequences. And this was the world that the Cree grew up in and lived in, and where their culture developed, and it created a profound sense of both a sense of humility and interdependence, but also a sense of strength and the need for, you know, a high level of mental, moral, and practical competence. and in many ways, you know, the Hudson's Bay Company people were drawn into that. And the Orkney Islanders who came over starting in the 1700s, in many ways were far more colonized than the Cree. If they came over, it was because you had Scots overlords who in many ways had pushed them off their own lands in the Orkneys. They were often impoverished, and signing up with the Hudson's Bay Company was a way to make some money and come back and you know, improve their own life back in Orkney. And many of them ended up staying in James Bay. But so those Orkney Islanders, in many ways, were, you know, more subject to colonization than the Crees that they encountered when they arrived. I mean, for the Crees, for much of this early history, Hudson's Bay Company posts were just they were a valuable source of assistance in rare times of starvation. But by and large, it was the Cree providing the Hudson's Bay Company with incredible amounts of food and staples and furs. I mean, the Hudson's Bay Company wouldn't have been there without them. So it was there was definitely a reciprocal relationship there, and the Hudson's Bay Company men could not impose themselves, even if they had wanted to, and some did want to, but they couldn't impose themselves until much later, and really in the 20th century. So, and that's not to say that they all did that, but it was just almost impossible to do that in the earlier period. So,
Cecil,
long answer, but
I was going to ask one of our members, international members, who's here today, is Indian, but now she's working in New Zealand, and I mean both countries have got their own colonial past. Manvi, hi. Don't want to put you on the spot, but does any of this strike a chord with any discussion going on now in India or in New Zealand? Are you there, Manvi? There she is.
Hey, Doug. I've had a discussion with a wood expert from India, and I'm trying to bring him over to the wood committee. And as soon as that develops, I think we can take the discussion forward about what's really going on with the wood conservation industry in India. And yeah, that's my progress so far.
But my question was more about what Cecil's been speaking about today, about colonialism and decolonization, and right. You know, it's creating a future out of the past, diversity, etc. I'm just wondering what, if any, similar conversations are going on in India and New Zealand at the moment.
With New Zealand, I think the unpacking hasn't really begun per se, and we're still, I mean, most of the architecture here is timber based, and while the conversation has begun that this is a bicultural landscape and there's a community that still exists and lives in these buildings as well. So but the conflict and which buildings to save, which not to save, that conversation hasn't begun really. Whereas in India, I think, we're still struggling to save structures. What we're facing, I mean, it's not with regards to timber, but a lot of postmodern heritage in India is facing that conflict at the moment. And with the current government being more right-leaning, a lot of 20th century British colonial architecture has come under threat, which sometimes is wood, but is also largely concrete or stone, masonry. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Manvi.
Sorry, I misunderstood your question the first time.
No, it's all right. It's okay.
Doug, there was a question from Evan.
Yes, I was just going to mention that next. You can, you want, I'll read it for you if you want. Evan is, thanks for the presentation. Can you speak about the variety of ways that built heritage and cultural landscapes are being interpreted now? Also, you mentioned tourism has dropped off in recent years. Just wondering why. Transport related?
So I'll start by answering the second one. It's not really transportation related. It's really the state of some of the more visible heritage sites, and also jurisdictional questions. So there's been, as I mentioned, in the past, the Hudson's Bay Company history tended to be emphasized without putting it in a broader and deeper Cree context sufficiently. Not always, but often that was the case. So there was a sense that this was this was sort of an outsider history, that with a younger generation especially, a sense that this is an outsider history, and you've got people within the community that at one point would have identified as people of mixed ancestry, whereas now some people who will say they will ignore the Scottish or Orkney heritage. So there are questions of identity, right? And I think the challenge for young people is to see that full history and its complexity and all of these connections. And so that's a big part of it is a tendency. Well, the challenge of navigating that history and integrating integrating the critique with also a preservation, right? And I think Norm spoke to that really powerfully. There's good and bad in this history, and it's not always easy to see the nuance of that. And I think some of that comes from outside influences coming in that are more black and white in terms of how they interpret that past. So I think that's the primary issue, is a neglect of some of the historic sites, heritage sites, because of that, but also because of a lot of jurisdictional gaps. And I could elaborate on that more if you want. I mean, St. Thomas Church, for example, is in it's not within a municipality. It's not within it's not on a First Nation reserve. It's owned by the Diocese of Moosonee that deconsecrated the building back in 2006. So there are challenges around ownership and management of the site and of the building that we're certainly addressing, but those things are definitely part of it. I think in many ways there's a lot of positive things that have happened in the last while, which is a greater emphasis on Cree traditions. So the Cree Cultural Interpretive Center has seen a lot more development. There's also the Washoe Lodge out at Hannah Bay. So there's definitely a revival of emphasis on Cree culture. The challenge now is to, I think, in many ways integrate that within the broader and deeper history of that Cree, Orkney, Scottish, English encounter that's part of people's bloodlines and heritage and history. So I guess that spoke to the first element of that question as well. So I'll just leave it there.
Well, I mean, that was an interesting answer. You kind of brought in a number of the challenges and the more complex challenges with the project for this humble building. The physical, the building challenges are really nothing that sort of many of us have not faced before. Repairing deteriorated timber. There's a log element. What you can't see is that the weatherboarding, the wood siding, is covering a log timber church, and the tower is separating from the main part of the building. But these are all problems that there's dodgy foundations and leaking roofs. To a certain extent, there are problems that we can understand and we can investigate and we can deal with. But I think what you're describing and what you're talking about today, Cecil, the real challenges are the sort of the cultural diversity challenges, the jurisdictional challenges, and these are challenges that are more challenging than the kind of the physical repair and conservation to some extent, and it's about how we make this whole process sustainable, because of course that the repairs today are not going to repairs today have to lead to a sustainable future for the church and for the community.
Yeah, and people of my generation and older who, I mean, the church was deconsecrated in 2006. Still, every summer there's a memorial service in the cemetery. Everybody has loved ones buried there. Almost everybody except for the youngest generations have been to weddings, baptisms, funerals in that church. So even those who are not Anglican and who have no connection with the church now still have a strong connection with the building. And by and large, there's a real desire to see it restored. But there are challenges of working through that history. And Grace Delaney, who's deacon, I mean, just to give an idea, her father is from Iwishchi, so he's Quebec Cree. He was born and raised in the bush, lived most of his life in the bush, working as a trapper, moved to Moose Factory, I think probably in his late 60s, and then continued working for another 20 years. Unilingual Cree, at his daughter's wedding, he got up and quoted at length from the Bible, from memory in Cree. And this is a man who is 100% Cree, wearing his rubber boots turned down with a corduroy shirt. He didn't need any paraphernalia to identify who he was. He was comfortable in his own skin, and it integrated, other traditions and technologies and cultures. But unilingual Cree, and his daughter is married John Delaney, who I mentioned earlier, and she's an Anglican deacon, and she spoke about the challenges for the younger generation, her grandchildren, for example, who find it challenging. Some of them find it challenging, integrating that history, and are often more critical than the older generation who went through these things. And part of that comes from how a lot of this history is being taught. It's very easy to, it's challenging to dig deeper into what went wrong without losing sight of what went right, or reducing everything to what went wrong. And I think there's a lot of it ties in with education and the kinds of challenges that you see in the US with race relations right now, and use the term, the pun, but a black and white views of history, right? And the need for greater nuance. And that's really challenging. So.
Thanks. Anything else? From anybody?
Alan had a comment wondering about the reciprocity reflected. I mean, several comments there, but
oh yeah, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, macro versus micro in colonialism. Yeah, historians ignoring the local story in favor of the big one. But the question, how much of this reciprocity is reflected in the HBC documentary record? It's definitely there, and you've got examples of Hudson's Bay Company men who began to interpret reality according to Cree perspective, and I hesitate to go further because there's some examples I could give, but it would require explaining certain concepts within Cree. The wheat to go or wind to go. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but it's a Cree way of explaining, you know, what happens, the madness and monstrosity and behaviors and extreme behaviors in time of starvation. So you know, yeah. So, but let me not jump into that. But let me just say that the reality of interdependence was one that fur traders learned fairly quickly, and also for many of those, especially from the Orkney Islands and Scotland, wouldn't have been a foreign reality, right? And you see it in the intermarriage, you see it in the sharing of musical traditions, you see it also in the HBC record. There is a lot more I could say on that, but I'm just mindful of time. But I could share an article on the Windigo concept and how non-Crees adopted that to understand, you know, mental and moral breakdown in times of starvation, and including starvation, cannibalism, violence, and madness.
Alan, does that answer your question or comment, Alan?
Yep, thanks very much. I've just, because in some of my own research on British Columbia and Alberta, going into fur trade records, you see a similar situation where the Hudson's Bay Company factor may be asserting a notion of control, but when you read the actual document, you get a sense that they're not quite as in control as they think they are, and they still require you know, the reciprocity to survive, even if they don't always fully admit it in the document.
Yes, and remember who they're writing those for, right? And there's
Yep.
a difference often between, you know, they're writing back to, you know, their superiors in London, right? And reporting on these things. But just to give you an example, and I think it was 19, there were about 10 Hudson's Bay Company men that died of starvation or exposure around James Bay in 1 year, okay? There were Cree also who died. But there were other Hudson's Bay Company people who survived because Cree came to their help. Cree people came to their help. So this is just one extreme winter. It was a difficult time. The supply ship was frozen in Hudson's Bay a couple of times, so they were not able to get resupplied. So they were very much dependent on local resources. Everybody was, and there was hardship experience all around. And at one point, Crees killed some Hudson's Bay Company people that they initially reached out to help, but once these people resorted to cannibalism, eating the flesh of people who had died in order to survive after they left the Cree camps to go back to their own camps to get some tobacco and other things, and they got lost. And anyways, they resorted to cannibalism, and the same Crees who initially reached out to help them ended their lives because of the fear that they were turning into Windigos as a result of resorting to cannibalism. And you know, the Hudson's Bay Company, you know, officials or the chief trader reporting back to London, you know, said, well, look, we didn't do anything, we didn't respond, there was no reprimand, nothing, because this is the Cree understanding of things, and he, you know, this hunter would have done the same thing had it been his own family members. In short, you know, this is the law of the land, and we have to respect it. There's no choice here, right? So that's really the reality for most of this period. Now, some who didn't understand the context, didn't understand the culture, they did respond poorly to incidents like that, right? They didn't understand what was going on, but others did, and they respected that. And you know, in many cases, many of these fur traders would be able to tell you stories of how Crees helped them in a difficult time. In fact, by and large, I think pretty much anybody from that era would have memory of occasions where it didn't matter how good you were as a hunter or how competent you were on the land. There was at least a few moments in your life when if so-and-so hadn't shown up to help you, you would be dead, right? And I mean, there are people my age who can tell you stories like that still to this day, right? So there's something about living in the north, whether it's in Orkney, making your life off the sea, or living in the Canadian North in the subarctic. There's something about that closeness to the land and that fragility that, you know, teaches you constantly these lessons of both humility and fortitude, if I can put it that way, right? A deep sense of interdependence and contingent being, right? Contingent relationship, but also a deep sense of the need to cultivate mental, moral, and practical competence, and above all, mental and moral, because you know you end up in some really difficult situations where you have to maintain that equilibrium in spite of extreme stress, right? So, so that's yeah, lots of stories of
Cecil,
those kinds of encounters. Yes.
Cecil, do you think that outlook, you know, you're talking about a sort of a uniquely northern outlook, whether it's the Norway or Orkney or Northern Ontario. Do you think that creates a similar or a unique outlook towards heritage and a view of heritage and the value of heritage?
Yes, I mean,
you know, in terms of an outlook or a view of heritage as a physical thing or an intangible thing. You know, whether the outlook is more to do with the intangible cultural heritage aspects more than the physical.
yes, I would say so. I think it's definitely. I mean, the Cree did not leave a lot of traces on the land. What you see are the grooves in ancient rocks on portage trails worn by moccasins over millennia, right? I mean, that's powerful, or fish weirs and things like this, right? So, but there's a tremendous connection to the land and stories about place that connect people, right? So that's very strong. But in some ways, it's also been, you could say, weakened and challenged. Well, just think of our social media and the digital revolution, right? It's brought in a lot of other cultural influences, but it's also the means by which, for example, the chair of the Moose River Heritage and Hospitality Association board shares, just to give you an, so obviously the access to a lot of cultural influences from elsewhere are in some ways weakening a sense of this unique heritage, but the digital technology is also allowing people to share that heritage. And so our board chair just put up a new, he's out at his goose hunting camp right now, and he put up a new tent frame, and he basically did he did a video of the entire tent frame construction, like in short, using sorry, I'm trying to find the words here, but just using frames, right? Speeding individual shots, condensed, and anyways, you know what I'm trying to say.
We know what you mean. We know what you mean.
Yes, there's a specific term, but anyways, so he shared this on Facebook. There's lots of people sharing many things related to the culture and heritage using the tools we have now, but working through how do you integrate these new tools, these new ideas, these new cultural influences. I mean, that's part of the same challenges that many other peoples elsewhere in the world are facing, right? And and there's some tremendous successes in that regard in the Moose River area, and also some signs that maybe a balance and equilibrium has not yet been found in other cases, right? So it's they're being lost along the way. So yeah.
Great. I'm looking at the time, and I'm wondering whether we're going to get cut off any minute now. But with one last question, one quick question, hopefully. Gisley was wondering if there are any standing examples of Cree architecture remaining, or are they more sort of archaeological in nature?
Well, you certainly have archaeological evidence there, and I mentioned some of the things, fish weirs and that. But you know, all over the community, behind people's homes, you'll often find a cook tent, which is a sort of a modern variation with plywood and tarpaulin of a traditional Cree teepee, and it's very practical, and it's where people go out and, you know, cook their geese and have family gatherings and around the fire. So you'll also see teepees. It'll be very common to see a teepee in the backyard as a cook tent. So the Cree architecture is very much still there. It's just,
this is like a renewing temporary architecture, isn't it?
exactly. These things are
Yes.
are constantly being renewed. So it's not this is not the kind of architecture you're going to find. You know, the remains of which they're not going to last very long, right? So because it's all wood and skins or fabric. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Cecil. Thank you. Excellent. I just wanted to close by saying, and I apologize for not saying this at the beginning. Cecil is the executive director of the Moose River Heritage and Hospitality Association, and in many ways he's almost made this his life's work. Well, you've been on it since the early 2000s, haven't you? So we're the Moose River must be, you know, happy to have you in the organization. We're happy to have you here. On behalf of everybody, thank you.
Well, thank you for the privilege of being able to speak with you and share these things. And I don't know if it was obvious, but I was born and raised in Moose Factory. My parents come from elsewhere, but it's still very much home to me. And I left for school, and I'm still sort of in the university context. All my graduate work really focused on the area. So it's been a real draw for me, and for many of the others actually involved in our various committees and in our organization. Many of them are living elsewhere now, but this initiative, the More Than 350 in 2023 initiative, is a way for people to keep those connections and to dig deeper into that history. So yeah.